The old courthouse in rural Pennsylvania was unusually crowded for a Wednesday morning. Rows of wooden benches were filled with attorneys, observers, and a few reporters scribbling notes. At the very front of the room, near the witness stand, sat 6-year-old Emily Taylor, tiny, quiet, and clutching tightly to the soft golden fur of her German shepherd. Scout. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs until the bailiff called, "All rise." Judge Martha Winslow entered, her robe flowing and face unreadable. Everyone stood, then sat as she took her seat and glanced over the custody case docket. Emily sat beside her mother, Lavra Taylor, who looked exhausted. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a tissue, eyes red from sleepless nights and fear. On the opposite side of the courtroom sat Don Taylor, Emily's father. He was dressed sharply in a tailored navy blue suit and had a confident air about him, almost too confident. His lawyer whispered something to him, and he nodded casually. Scout, wearing a certified therapy dog vest, lay calmly at Emily's feet, his eyes occasionally flicking up to check on her. The court had permitted him to remain beside Emily due to a therapist's request. No one had expected a dog to become a pivotal character in a custody hearing, but Scout was no ordinary pet. He had been with Emily since she was 3, through every nightmare, every scraped knee, and every long night when she cried about the world changing around her. Judge Winslow reviewed the papers in front of her, then looked directly at Lavra. "Ms. Taylor, your petition requests continued custody of your daughter. The father has petitioned for full custody. Both sides claim to act in Emily's best interest. We will hear statements from both." Lavra stood shakily. Her voice was soft, but honest. "Your Honor, I may not have a mansion or a luxury car, but I have built a life full of love and safety for Emily. I work 2 jobs to make ends meet. Our home may be small, but it's filled with warmth. And Scout, he's more than a dog. He's part of her emotional support system. He calms her when she panics. He helps her sleep." Dan's lawyer immediately objected, questioning the appropriateness of using a dog in court as an emotional appeal. The judge waved it off. He's allowed. A motion for the therapy animal was granted. Dan leaned in and whispered again to his attorney, smirking. Emily remained quiet the entire time, petting Scout's ear gently, her eyes scanning the courtroom like a child too wise for her years. Every word her mother said registered in her young face. She didn't fully understand the law, or the paperwork, or the fancy words people used. But she knew what losing meant. It meant she might have to leave her mom. It meant Scout might not be allowed to come. Scout, sensing her anxiety rising, adjusted himself so his body leaned into her leg. Emily whispered something in his ear. He blinked slowly in return. The courtroom proceeded through motions and paperwork. But Emily was barely aware of the adults around her. Her eyes drifted between her mom and Scout, holding on to what little stability she had. When Dan stood to speak, his voice was firm, practiced, and persuasive. "Emily needs structure. She needs the kind of opportunities that my financial stability can offer: better schools, a proper neighborhood, a stepmother who's already planning after-school activities." He glanced briefly at Laura. "She deserves more than makeshift living and handouts." Scout let out a low grumble. Emily's face tightened. She leaned into Scout, pressing her forehead against his neck as the judge called for a short recess. The tension in the room didn't ease. If anything, it tightened around Emily like a string being pulled at both ends. She knew her world was being split in 2. But deep inside, she also knew that she and Scout had one last card to play, one little signal that no one else in the room would understand. Not yet. Asterisk. The courtroom settled back into a tense silence as Lavra Taylor rose again. Her shoulders were squared, but her hands trembled slightly. She looked straight ahead, eyes briefly meeting her daughter's before turning to face the judge. "Your Honor," Lavra began, voice steady despite the emotions beneath. I admit I don't have the luxury of a big house or a steady salary, but what I have is a home filled with love and stability. Emily's happiness and safety have always been my priority. She paused and swallowed hard. When Emily was diagnosed with anxiety at age 4, it changed everything for us. Nights were the hardest. She would cry, panic, and sometimes refuse to sleep alone. That's when Scout came into our lives. He's more than a pet. He's a lifeline. Scout sat quietly beside Emily's chair, resting his massive head on her lap, as if understanding every word. The judge nodded slowly, but said nothing. Laura continued, we live in a modest apartment, but it's Emily's safe place. I work nights as a waitress and days, cleaning offices to pay rent and keep food on the table. I make sacrifices because Emily deserves to feel secure, to have a childhood where she feels loved and supported. Laura's eyes glistened with tears, but she blinked them away. I know I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes, but I am her mother, the one who's been there through every nightmare and every triumph. She needs me, and she needs Scout. Dan's attorney quickly stood, prepared to question Laura on her ability to provide a stable environment. Ms. Taylor, how can a child thrive in an apartment with no yard, no room to run, and relying on a dog for emotional support? Does that not seem like an excuse for your shortcomings? Laura's jaw tightened. Scout isn't a crutch. He's a trained therapy dog. The psychologist who works with Emily recommended him because he helps her regulate panic attacks. Emily sleeps better, attends school more confidently, and has fewer breakdowns. Emily, normally quiet during these moments, clutched Scout's thick fur. Scout licked her hand gently, reassuring her. The judge watched closely, absorbing every detail. Dan shifted in his seat. His lawyer pressed on. Isn't it true that Ms. Taylor's financial instability could harm Emily's future? Education, healthcare, opportunities. These require resources she currently cannot provide. Lavra took a deep breath. I may not have wealth, but I have perseverance and love. And Emily has Scout. Together, we face the world's challenges. Every day, the courtroom remained silent for a moment. Even Dan's confident expression flickered as the weight of Laura's words settled. Outside, reporters whispered quietly. Some jurors glanced at Scout, recognizing the unusual presence of a dog in court. To many, Scout was more than an animal. He was a symbol of hope and resilience. Emily glanced up at her mother, and then at Scout, feeling the fierce protectiveness that bound them. She didn't understand all the legal jargon, but she understood that this moment could change everything. Judge Winslow closed the folder in front of her and announced a short recess. The family, their lawyers, and observers filed out quietly. As Lavra knelt beside Emily in the hall, she whispered softly, no matter what happens in there, you and Scout are my whole world. Emily nodded solemnly. Scout and I have a secret, she said quietly. Lavra looked puzzled, but smiled gently. What secret? Emily only smiled back shyly, as if guarding something precious. Scout rested his head on Emily's shoulder, a silent guardian ready for whatever came next. The courtroom reconvened after the brief recess, the tension as thick as ever. Dan Taylor rose slowly, his sharp navy suit contrasting with the humble surroundings. He approached the stand with the confidence of a man used to getting what he wanted. His voice was calm, but firm as he began to paint a different picture of his vision for Emily's future. Your Honor, Dan said, glancing briefly at the judge, I understand the emotional bonds in this case, but I ask you to consider the facts. I offer Emily stability, a home in a safe neighborhood, access to private education, and the chance to grow up in an environment conducive to success. He paused, scanning the room, as if daring anyone to challenge him. I have remarried, and my wife is eager to be a stepmother to Emily. Together, we can provide what every child needs: structure, opportunity, and guidance." His lawyer nodded approvingly, but Emily felt a cold wave wash over her. This wasn't about love or comfort. It was about contracts and benefits. She clutched Scout's fur tighter. The dog's ears flicked back, sensing Emily's unease. Dan continued, "With all due respect, Miss Taylor's living situation is far from ideal. A small apartment, multiple jobs with inconsistent hours. It is not a place for a child to thrive. And as for the dog, I see Scout as a distraction, an emotional crutch that shouldn't dictate custody decisions." A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. Scout growled quietly, low and controlled, but enough to make heads turn. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She wished she could speak up, but was too small and too scared. Her fingers trembled, brushing against Scout's thick coat. She wished the judge could see what she saw, the way Scout's eyes held her steady during storms, how his presence stopped nightmares. Dan's lawyer pressed on. "Children need discipline and routine, not indulgence. I'm prepared to provide Emily with everything necessary for a bright future. Isn't that what a parent should do?" Laura's eyes flashed with quiet fire. When her lawyer asked if she wanted to respond, she shook her head, knowing that this was Dan's moment to try to sway the court. The judge made a note and then asked Dan a pointed question, "Mr. Taylor, how do you intend to handle Emily's special needs, particularly her anxiety, without Scout?" Dan hesitated, a crack in his otherwise composed demeanor. I believe professional therapy and medication can help her without relying on a dog." The psychologist in the courtroom, seated near the back, shook her head slightly. She understood the gravity of that statement better than anyone. Emily squeezed Scout's paw and whispered, "Please stay." The courtroom remained silent as Dan sat down, the weight of the moment settling in. Judge Winslow glanced from Dan to Laura, then finally to Emily, who sat silently beside Scout, her small hand resting protectively on the dog's shoulder. The courtroom was a battleground of facts and feelings. But only Emily and Scout knew the truth of their bond, a secret language that no amount of money or stability could replace. Asterisk. The courtroom buzzed quietly as the judge called for a short recess, allowing everyone to step outside. Laura immediately knelt beside Emily, her eyes filled with worry and warmth. "Sweetheart," she whispered, brushing a stray curl from Emily's forehead, "no matter what happens, you are loved, always." Emily looked up, her wide eyes reflecting the fear and uncertainty she felt deep inside. "Mom," she said softly, clutching Scout's fur tighter, "Scout and I have a secret. When I'm scared or sad, I give him a special signal. It's our way of saying I need him." Lavra smiled gently, unsure what to make of the comment, but wanting to comfort her daughter. "That's wonderful, baby. You and Scout are a team." Back inside the courtroom, the judge prepared to deliver his preliminary ruling. The tension thickened as the lawyers exchanged quick, calculated glances. Emily's heart pounded, but she remained still beside Scout, who rested his head on her lap. Suddenly, as the judge cleared his throat to speak, Emily raised her tiny hand. Slowly, she lifted it and began to move her fingers in a swirling, circular motion, like she was drawing invisible patterns in the air. The gesture was subtle, almost whimsical, like a game only she and Scout understood. Everyone in the courtroom froze. The judge blinked, eyebrows raised. The lawyers exchanged surprised looks. Even Dan's confident demeanor faltered for a moment. Scout's ears perked instantly. Without hesitation, he rose gracefully and padded quietly to the center of the courtroom. The dog sat down firmly, eyes fixed on the judge. Then, in a hauntingly low and mournful howl, Scout let out a single steady sound. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge looked taken aback, his gavel poised but motionless. For a moment, silence ruled the room, an unspoken acknowledgement that something unusual, something powerful, was unfolding before their eyes. Laura's lips parted in shock. Dan's face turned pale, his eyes wide. Reporters instinctively reached for their phones, sensing this was no ordinary hearing. The judge finally broke the silence. "Ms. Taylor, what is the meaning of this signal? And why did your dog respond in such a way?" Lavra swallowed hard, glancing at Emily, who was now staring straight ahead, composed and calm. "Your Honor, Emily and Scout have a unique bond." That swirling hand motion is a signal she was taught during therapy to indicate anxiety or distress. Scout is trained to respond immediately. He comforts her and alerts others if she's feeling unsafe. A child psychologist seated in the courtroom rose and nodded. "That is correct, Your Honor. This signal is part of a trauma therapy protocol. Scout has been trained to recognize Emily's cues and respond appropriately to help regulate her anxiety. It is not just a pet's behavior, it's a critical part of Emily's emotional well-being." The courtroom shifted. The sterile legal atmosphere gave way to empathy. Even Dan's steely gaze softened, if only slightly. The judge leaned forward, intrigued. "This changes the nature of the case. Emotional well-being is paramount in determining a child's best interest. I will call for a brief recess to confer with the psychologist." Emily exhaled slowly, the weight in her chest easing. Scout returned to her side, nudging her hand gently with his nose. Outside the courtroom, Lavra hugged Emily tightly. "You are so brave," she whispered. Emily smiled faintly. "Scout and I will always have our secret," she replied. Inside, the judge and experts huddled quietly, understanding that this case had grown beyond simple custody. It was about a bond that no legal paper could easily break. The courtroom was filled with a tense hush as the judge returned from recess, accompanied by the child psychologist who had explained Emily and Scout's unique bond. The atmosphere had shifted. What had once been a dry legal proceeding had become something deeply human and emotional. Judge Winslow looked over her glasses, her gaze steady. "We have considered the significance of Miss Taylor's testimony regarding the therapeutic relationship between Emily and Scout. It appears this bond is essential for Emily's emotional stability." Emily sat quietly beside Scout, who remained alert, his body close to hers like a shield. The judge continued, "Mr. Taylor, the court acknowledges your concerns about providing financial stability and a structured home. However, it must also weigh the emotional needs and safety of the child, especially considering her history of anxiety and trauma." Don nodded slowly, but remained silent, the reality of the situation settling on him in a way that words could not express. The judge then addressed the room. "To better understand the dynamics here, I would like to hear directly from Emily, with the assistance of the child psychologist and legal guardians present, to ensure she feels safe and heard." Emily's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded, trusting Scout, who rested his head on her lap. In a quiet corner of the courtroom, away from the spectators, Emily was asked simple questions about her feelings, her life, and most importantly, Scout. "Emily," the psychologist asked gently, "can you tell us how Scout helps you?" Emily looked at Scout and whispered, "He makes the scary feelings go away. When I feel nervous or sad, I make a signal, and Scout knows. He stays close, he licks my hand, and sometimes he howls to tell Mom and the judge I'm scared." "They," psychologist smiled warmly. "That's right. Scout is trained to respond to Emily's signals, giving her comfort and protection." A judge nodded thoughtfully. "Emily, where do you feel safest?" Emily looked down for a moment, then pointed to Scout and then to her mother. "Here," she said softly. The courtroom, previously filled with formal faces, was now silent. With empathy, Don glanced at Emily, something shifting inside him. For the first time, he saw beyond the custody papers and legal arguments to the scared little girl who needed more than structure. She needed love and understanding. After the private session, the judge called the courtroom back to order. This testimony has shed light on the critical role Scout plays in Emily's life. It is clear that removing Scout could negatively impact her well-being. Lavra squeezed Emily's hand, tears prickling in her eyes. Scout leaned in, his tail wagging gently. Dan rose, his voice quieter than before. Your Honor, I must admit, I underestimated the importance of Scout to Emily. I was focused on what I thought she needed, not what she truly needs. The judge nodded. Mr. Taylor, your willingness to acknowledge this is a positive step. The court paused as the weight of the moment settled in. The bond between Emily and Scout was undeniable, a lifeline in a complicated world. As the day wore on, the judge promised a thorough review of all evidence, emphasizing that Emily's emotional health would be paramount in the final decision. Emily sat back beside Scout, feeling a sense of relief for the first time in months. She whispered, Thank you, Scout. You did it. Scout gave a gentle bark, as if understanding the gravity of the moment. Outside the courtroom, reporters whispered about the unusual but touching bond between a tiny girl and her dog that had changed the course of a legal battle. The court recessed for the day, leaving a hushed energy lingering in the corridors of the old courthouse. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the worn stone steps, while inside, Emily sat quietly on a bench with Scout lying beside her, his head resting gently on her lap. The warmth of the day contrasted sharply with the uncertainty. Hanging over her future. Lavra approached her daughter, her eyes softening as she knelt down. Emily, do you want to tell me more about Scout and your special signal? She asked gently. Emily nodded shyly. When I feel scared or upset, I do this, she said, lifting her hand and twirling her fingers in a soft swirl, their secret sign. Scout knows it means I need him. He comes right away, and sometimes he howls so Mom, the judge, know I'm scared. Lavra smiled through tears. You're so brave, baby. Scout really is your best friend. As they talked, Dan sat alone. Nearby, his hands clenched into fists. He had listened carefully to the psychologist's report, realizing how much he had misunderstood. He had thought that financial security and strict rules were all Emily needed. But hearing about Scout's role, how he calmed Emily's panic attacks and gave her confidence, opened his eyes. Later, the judge called a private session with both parents and the child psychologist. Mr. Taylor, Judge Winslow said firmly, but kindly, it is clear that Emily's well-being depends not only on material stability, but also on emotional security. Removing Scout from her life could have severe consequences. Dan swallowed hard. I didn't understand. I thought I was doing what was best, but maybe I was wrong. The psychologist nodded. Emily's anxiety is serious. Scout's training allows him to recognize her signs of distress before they escalate. He gives her safety in ways therapy alone cannot. Dan looked over at Emily, who sat quietly beside Laura, Scout's fur warm beneath her fingers. For the first time, he saw her not as a prize to be won, but as a fragile, complex little person. I want to be part of her life, Dan said quietly, and I want to learn how to support her. And Scout, the judge smiled softly. That willingness is a good foundation. We will work on a plan that includes all of you. Back in the courtroom, the mood was different. The legal battle was no longer about money or schedules, but about healing and understanding. The judge spoke directly to Emily. You are very brave. It's important that you feel safe and loved. Emily nodded shyly, her hand still resting on Scout's head. Scout wagged his tail, sensing that the fight was moving in the right direction. As the court adjourned for the day, Lavra hugged Emily tightly. "We'll get through this," she promised. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the courthouse in warm, golden light, a symbol of hope for a family still finding its way. The courtroom was quieter than before when Dan Taylor rose to speak. His usual confidence was tempered by a newfound humility, and the room sensed a shift in his demeanor. He looked at Emily, seated beside Laura and Scout, and for the first time saw the depth of her need, not just for a home, but for love and understanding. "Your Honor," Dan began, voice softer than earlier, "I want to apologize. I thought I knew what was best for Emily, but I didn't understand her needs fully. I was focused on stability and order, but she needs more than that. She needs comfort, security, and the support of Scout." Lavra looked at him, surprised but hopeful. Dan continued, "I want to be a better father. I want to learn how to help her, and I want to respect the bond she has with Scout. I realize now that her emotional well-being comes first." The judge nodded approvingly. "Acknowledging your daughter's needs is a crucial step." Dan's lawyer quietly added, "We are willing to work with Miss Taylor to ensure Emily's best interests are met." Emily's eyes brightened, and Scout wagged his tail. Sensing the change, the judge turned to Emily. "Emily, where do you feel safest?" She looked down for a moment, then pointed at Scout, and then at Lavra. "Here," she whispered. The courtroom was still. The judge smiled softly. "Then that will be part of the custody arrangement. Primary custody with Miss Taylor, with Mr. Taylor having generous visitation. Scout will remain with Emily." There was a soft murmur of approval. The decision was balanced and compassionate. Outside the courtroom, the air felt lighter. Dan approached Laura and Emily. "I'm sorry for all the hurt," he said sincerely. "I want us to be a family." Lavra nodded. "For Emily's sake, we will try." Emily hugged Scout tightly, whispering, "We did it, Scout." Scout barked softly as if to say, "Always." As they left the courthouse, the small family walked together, imperfect but hopeful. The final day in court dawned bright and clear, a contrast to the heavy tension that had filled the room in previous sessions. Emily clutched Scout's fur tightly, feeling the steady heartbeat of her loyal companion beneath her fingertips. Today was the day that would decide the future she had dreamt about in quiet moments. A future where love and stability could coexist. Judge Winslow entered, her expression calm but resolute. After careful consideration of all evidence and testimonies, this court recognizes that Emily's well-being depends not only on financial security, but on emotional support and stability. She looked directly at Emily. "Emily, your courage has been remarkable." Turning to the parents, she continued, "Primary custody will be granted to Laura Taylor, with the condition that Scout remains with Emily at all times. Dan Taylor will have visitation rights and is ordered to participate in parenting classes focused on supporting children with special emotional needs." The courtroom was silent, the verdict clear but heartfelt. Laura's eyes filled with tears as she squeezed Emily's hand. Dan nodded solemnly, accepting the decision with grace. Emily looked up at Scout and smiled, a bright and genuine smile that seemed to light up the entire room. Scout wagged his tail enthusiastically, as if sharing in the victory. After the hearing, reporters gathered to ask Laura how she felt. "It's more than a legal win," she said, voice trembling with emotion. "It's a chance for Emily to grow up feeling safe and loved." Dan spoke quietly to the press. "I've learned so much about Emily's needs and about what being a father really means. I'm committed to being there for her." As they left the courthouse, the family walked together, not perfect, but united in a new understanding. Emily whispered to Scout, "We're going home, buddy." Scout barked softly, his tail wagging. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it felt full of hope. Outside, the sun shone warmly on the steps, a silent promise that no matter what challenges lay ahead, love and loyalty would guide their way.